Greetings and welcome to an LG Arcade thing. And this time we're going to take a look at one of my technological obsessions, playing classic arcade games straight from the original hardware. That's right, no emulation here. I'm talking legit arcade printed circuit boards, or PCBs, adapted for use with the display and control method of your choosing. Turns out it's a relatively straightforward endeavor with the right combination of conversion hardware, and that's what we're exploring today. Setting up and playing arcade PCBs using things like JAMMA superguns, interface converters, RGB video transcoders, input adapters, and more. This won't be an exhaustive overview of every possibility, and there's always the odd snag to solve with certain games, but I hope this proves informative regardless, and if nothing else, just sit back, relax, and enjoy some retro arcade gaming goodness. Right, so there are 5 components key to making things happen: an arcade PCB, a supergun device, a power supply, a controller, and a display, and possibly a video converter or two depending on your display. So naturally, the first step is acquiring an arcade PCB in the first place, and for me that first board was Raiden 2 from 1993, one of my all-time favorites from back in the day. By and large, finding standalone PCBs is a lot easier than finding the complete cabinet, since so many cabs were scrapped and repurposed over the years, and plenty of boards were sold on their own as conversion kits as well, like Capcom's 1942 here, intended to be placed into a generic cabinet or swapped in to upgrade an older one. As for pricing, market values are all over the place. I've got some for as little as $75 shipped, while others cost several $100 when all was said and done. Either way, it goes without saying that PCBs are often far more affordable compared to a full machine. Paying $150 for Primal Rage may seem a bit silly at first, but compared to $1,000 plus $600 shipping for the full cabinet, it becomes a bit more palatable. Primal Rage was the second PCB I purchased, by the way, this gigantic Atari GT system board, complete with its 2 daughter boards screwed in on top and a solid metal plate underneath. Not only is it one of my all-time favorites from 1994, but, as of this recording, it's still not fully emulated with 100% accuracy due to the onboard security chip, so having the original PCB is currently the best way to play it. It's also a good example of a board that needs a little extra attention to get working. I've done a whole video about this over on my Blurbs channel, but the gist of it is that the sound won't play unless you connect these boards together using the appropriate cables. And the controls won't fully work either without an adapter like this one, the JNX Rage. Yeah, one of the buttons doesn't work unless you either have the original wiring harness or use an adapter, even though it's a JAMMA PCB. JAMMA, by the way, stands for Japan Amusement Machine and Marketing Association. And it's a standard used by most arcade games from 1987 to the early 2000s, made after a bunch of companies came together in the 80s and agreed on a universal wiring standard. And it's this JAMMA standard that supergun devices are meant to connect to and convert. For older games that don't use JAMMA though, there are a couple different options. One is just wiring up your own JAMMA adapter, stringing together the connections and making sure it all lines up between the two. Another option is getting one of these conversion boards, which a multitude of hobbyists have put together and offered for sale for popular arcade PCBs, making it easy to adapt them to work with a JAMMA supergun. Speaking of which, the supergun is really the heart of this whole setup and ultimately determines everything else you need. To put it simply, superguns are devices that plug into the JAMMA connector of an arcade PCB and convert it to a set of standard AV inputs and outputs. This way you can skip needing an arcade wiring harness and can easily plug in your own stuff. Just attach your PCB right here, plug in a 15-pin Neo Geo style joystick over here, insert your video cable and any speakers or headphones here, and in this case connect a standard ATX PC power supply. And for a good number of games, that's it. You're good to go, assuming you've got a compatible display. There are buttons on the supergun for inserting coins and accessing service menus, but everything else happens on the joystick itself, with the game happily playing along just like it's sitting in a real arcade machine. What a sight to behold! 8-year-old me would have no idea what to think of this. As for which supergun to use, that depends on your needs and desires. There's a whole slew of superguns out there with wildly varying features and connections, often hand-built in small quantities by enthusiasts. One of the most popular being the Home Arcade System, or HAZ supergun. Unfortunately though, actually getting your hands on one can be tricky with limited production runs and waiting lists. So I went with something cheap and readily available, at least at first. This Retro Electronic Essentials Basic. It's nothing to write home about, but it did the job when I was just getting started. Before long, I upgraded to Retro Electronics Pro Gamer 1.3. This does the same thing as the basic model, but it also has a built-in power regulator to generate a negative 5-volt rail right on the board. If you're using a newer ATX power supply, that's important to have since certain games will require negative 5 volts to run properly. This was commonplace on older power supplies, but on modern ones it's pretty much disappeared entirely, so a supergun with a regulator is convenient for games like NBA Jam Tournament Edition that require negative 5 volts to power the soundboard. On games like this, the main board handles everything but sound, so you need this sound PCB to go along with it, populated with the proper allotment of ROMs for Tournament Edition. But back to the power supply and the regulator though, because this ATX solution isn't always optimal. Depending on your PSU, you may get more or less voltage than you need, causing some games to grow unstable. In that case, you'll want a proper arcade power supply instead of ATX, with a voltage adjustment knob to dial things in precisely. However, even with power sorted, I wasn't done trying different superguns yet. My final selection for the time being is the Parsec Supergun version 2.1. It's only available in small batches each month, but it's worth the wait if you're into what it's offering. For one thing, it's a lot smaller, not bothering with any extraneous terminals, while also providing additional things like composite and S-video outputs. And instead of a full-sized SCART connector, it uses an 8-pin mini DIN connector for RGB, same exact type used on devices like the FrameMeister. As an aside, I've got one of those too, but I don't really like the results I get with many arcade games, and find the open source Scan Converter, or OSSC, has a cleaner and less laggy output. Another reason I wanted a Parsec was its daughter board support, like this one that adds both 15-pin VGA and component video output with composite and TTL level syncing for RGB output without a SCART adapter. Oh, and another thing I like on the Parsec is the more standard kick harness interface, this little 6-pin JST header. The Retro Electronic boards use this 9-pin D-sub instead, whereas the Home Arcade System, the Parsec, and others have been going with this 6-pin JST connection, so it seemed like the better choice. As for what the kick harness does, well, it's for games with lots of action buttons or more than 2 players. The JAMMA standard supports 3 buttons plus start for up to 2 players, so if a game needed more than that, you use a kick harness on top of JAMMA. And in the case of a supergun, that means you need to connect the harness to the device itself. There are tons of standards too, with Capcom, Midway, Atari, Namco, and others all using different kick harness connectors, so you need to either solder together a harness yourself or just grab a pre-built one online. And finally, I also want to mention arcade systems that require separate plug-in cartridges like the Neo Geo MVS and the Sega STV, among others. Systems like these require not only the system PCB, but a separate game cartridge, designed so that arcade owners could easily swap out old games for new ones without buying a new machine. And yep, they use JAMMA too, so you can hook them up to a supergun just like any of the others. Of course, this cartridge approach also opens up a whole new set of arcade collection options, since the game carts themselves are often less expensive and easier to find than an entire dedicated arcade game PCB. And personally, I really enjoy collecting MVS games anyway, with their giant cartridges that tuck nicely into these Southtown shock boxes. As for the Neo Geo system itself, this one here is an MV1FZ, which is one of the many different single-slot MVS boards. There are 2, 4, and 6 slot boards as well, but I'm happy with just the one. It's also got this nice Lions 3 acrylic case to make it a bit easier to mount cartridges and protect the board itself. The prevalence of Neo Geo hardware in the arcade scene is one reason so many superguns choose that as its controller port as well. Not only are they pretty excellent sticks and pads in their own right, but the 15-pin interface supports all kinds of stuff beyond just the 4 face buttons, start and select, of the MVS. In fact, what I use the most these days are a couple of these Namco arcade sticks for the PlayStation. I actually like the built-in buttons better than the stock MVS, and the fact that you get more buttons laid out in a row like this makes it ideal for fighting games with more than 4 buttons. Obviously, it needs to be converted though, so I use these PlayStation to Neo Geo V3 adapters from Retro Electronic. These are a step up from other adapters I have in that they allow auto-fire speed adjustment and complete input remapping, so you can customize each button to match the layout of different arcade games. Oh, and one more thing regarding controllers and games designed for 3 or more players. In titles like The Simpsons, X-Men, or TMNT here, the way you usually choose your character is by physically selecting their assigned joystick on the cabinet. But what if you've only got 2 joysticks? You can only select the first 2 characters, right? Normally, yes, most of these are 4-player boards. Thankfully, there are also ROM swaps available, often known as 2-player conversion kits. Swapping out these chips on your PCB will allow every character in these games to be selected using any joystick, regardless of where they're physically plugged in. Something to keep in mind if you don't have 3 or 4 joysticks hooked up using a kick harness. Moving on to the display, since there are things to consider with both analog and digital video. Most superguns are made to output 75 ohm signals suitable to consumer televisions, making it pretty simple to just plug and play on most TVs and monitors. Being that SCART isn't a thing here in the US though, you may need to use a transcoder if your supergun only has SCART. I use this RetroTink RGB to component box, which passes a clean SCART signal through to the YPB-PR inputs on TVs like this Sony Trinitron. However, this doesn't work with every game. A few boards I have, like Mortal Kombat 2, output a signal that results in a vertically rolling screen on all my consumer TV sets. And in my case, the only CRT I have with both V-Hold and RGB is this 12-inch Sony PVM, which is just too small for long-term use. Another option is to use a VGA computer monitor, like this 17-inch ViewSonic. And while it looks superb, there's a little bit of trickery going on here. See, most VGA monitors like this only accept 31 kHz horizontal refresh rates, while arcade games, for the most part, tend to output 15 kHz instead. So unless you're lucky enough to have a multi-sync VGA monitor, you're going to need to convert the conversion with another converter. For most situations like this, I really like using the OSSC, which takes RGB signals and converts them over to a crispy, well-behaved HDMI video signal. Of course, that means that I need to use yet another adapter with my VGA monitors since they don't take HDMI, which muddies up the signals a bit. As stated before, this is one reason I wanted a Parsec Supergun with the video daughter board, but that still only outputs a 15 kHz signal, not 31. For this reason, a lot of folks end up using something like the GBS 8220, which does the job in terms of providing 31 kHz over VGA. But the interface is a pain to use and the output is somewhat soft. A far better option is the Irken Labs RetroScaler A1, which uses line doubling to up the 15 kHz signal to 31 kHz as clean and lag-free as possible, ideal for CRT monitors. Sometimes though, I still end up using a modern LCD monitor instead. As much as I love CRTs, they can be a hassle to set up and I don't always have a ton of room. Plus, this one has built-in speakers, and I've got it installed in this rotating stand, making it a nice choice for vertically scrolling shooters like Raiden Fighters 2 here. Or any other Tate vertical mode games really, of which there were plenty. Turning a tube on its side is awesome too, of course, but I'd really like a larger PVM or BVM before going down that route. Besides, a decent LCD combined with the OSSC and maybe some subtle scanline emulation here and there, I think it looks great, all things considered, and the convenience factor alone goes a long way. The last thing I want to touch on real quick is actually storing these things because, yeah, they're a tad awkward in the size and shape department, measuring anywhere from 10 by 16 by a ½ inch on up to 16 by 19 by 4 inches and beyond. And it's best to store them vertically, like you would vinyl records or computer games, due to gravity existing and warping stuff that shouldn't be warped. I've tried several storage solutions, but I've settled on these Craft tab-locking literature mailers packed with anti-static convoluted foam inside. It's nicer than just reusing old post office shipping boxes, which is what I was doing before, due to the sturdy box design meant for easy opening and closing. In the future, I plan to print out some nice color labels for each box, styled after the arcade marquees for the games themselves, but yeah, simple Dymo labels work well enough for now. And that's about it for the arcade PCB experience, at least for this video. It's been quite the process putting together a setup that makes sense for what I want, and it hasn't exactly been cheap if I'm being honest. But it's also hugely rewarding, and it's not nearly as hard on the wallet or on storage space as buying complete machines either. Which, I mean, I've got one of those too. This Missile Command Cabaret cabinet from 1980. I've had a blast fixing it up and I love the way it looks, but it's only one game after all, so being able to have a bunch more ready to play at any time is a treat. And don't get me wrong, I'm not against building a multicade cabinet or using MAME emulation. Both are also fantastic options. There are even FPGA solutions now that provide highly accurate recreations of original arcade hardware. But to me, there's an almost magical quality to actual arcade boards, and running them on their own outside of a cabinet feels wrong in the best kind of way. Like just seeing an arcade classic like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles running flawlessly through a modern TV is a downright chuckle-worthy thing to experience, and I'm psyched that the hobbyist community has come together to make it so easy for arcade newcomers to pull off. And if you enjoyed this video, then great! I've covered more arcade stuff in the past and release videos on all kinds of retro tech each week right here on LGR. And as always, thank you very much for watching.